17 weddings. 17 white dresses. 17 times Rebecca Mitchell stood smiling beside another bride, while silently asking a question she was almost afraid to pray anymore. Lord, when will it be my turn? For nearly 2 decades, she watched the people around her receive the very blessing she had begged God for. Friends she had prayed with. Friends who came to her for relationship advice. Friends who once cried on her shoulder about being single. One by one, they found love, walked down the aisle, started families, and moved into the future Rebecca had always imagined for herself. Yet somehow, she remained standing on the sidelines. What made the pain harder was that Rebecca wasn't running from God. She wasn't rejecting his guidance. She wasn't living a reckless life. She was doing everything she knew to do. She prayed faithfully. She served faithfully. She trusted faithfully. And still, year after year, heaven seemed painfully quiet. There were nights when she sat alone in her apartment staring at old wedding invitations she had never thrown away, wondering if perhaps she had misunderstood God's plan for her life. Had she missed her opportunity? Had she made a mistake somewhere along the way? Or was God simply saying no? What Rebecca could not see was that a story had already begun unfolding years earlier. A story hidden behind closed doors, hidden inside decisions she knew nothing about, hidden inside a future she could not yet imagine. Because while she spent years mourning a door that refused to open, God was protecting her from walking through it. And the truth behind that protection would remain concealed until a single conversation years later revealed something that left her completely speechless. Something that transformed every unanswered prayer. Something that changed every painful memory. Something that made her look back at the darkest seasons of her life and realize that what felt like abandonment had actually been mercy. This is the true story of a woman who believed God had forgotten her. A woman who watched 17 friends get married while she remained single. A woman who almost gave up asking why. And the astonishing discovery that finally revealed why God's delay may have been the greatest gift she ever received. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Rebecca Mitchell's story began long before the 17 weddings, long before the unanswered prayers, long before the nights she would sit alone wondering whether God had overlooked her. She grew up in a small American town where faith wasn't something reserved for Sunday mornings. It was woven into everyday life. Before every meal, her family prayed. Before every road trip, they prayed. When someone was sick, they prayed. When someone received good news, they prayed. God wasn't treated like a distant figure living somewhere beyond the clouds. He was spoken about as if he were a trusted member of the family. Some of Rebecca's earliest memories involved sitting beside her mother in a wooden church pew, swinging her legs back and forth while listening to stories from the Bible. She loved hearing about Esther's courage, Ruth's loyalty, and Hannah's prayers. As a little girl, she was especially fascinated by stories of women who trusted God through difficult seasons and eventually witnessed his faithfulness. Those stories planted something deep inside her heart. By the time she reached her teenage years, Rebecca wasn't attending church simply because her parents expected her to. Her faith had become personal. She carried a worn Bible in her backpack. She volunteered in youth programs. She helped organize church events. Friends often came to her when they needed encouragement because Rebecca seemed to possess a quiet confidence that God was guiding her future. Like many young women, she imagined what her life might look like someday. She dreamed about marriage. She dreamed about a loving husband. She dreamed about building a family centered on faith. Sometimes she would picture herself sitting on a porch years in the future, watching her children play while her husband laughed beside her. It wasn't an obsession. It wasn't an idol. It was simply one of the beautiful desires she carried in her heart. And because she trusted God completely, she assumed he was leading her toward that future. Whenever doubts appeared, her mother would gently remind her of a verse she had heard countless times growing up. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. Rebecca believed those words. Even when life became difficult, even when answers didn't come quickly, even when circumstances didn't make sense. At 18 years old, she packed her belongings and prepared to leave for college. It felt like the beginning of everything she had been praying for. The future stretched before her like an open road filled with possibilities. She arrived on campus carrying 2 suitcases, a well-worn Bible, family photographs, and a heart overflowing with hope. She believed God was opening the next chapter of her story. What she didn't know was that the chapter ahead would eventually become the source of years of questions, years of tears, and years of waiting. Because somewhere on that campus was a young man who would completely alter the course of her life. A young man Rebecca would become convinced was part of God's plan. A young man whose name would remain connected to some of her deepest heartbreak. And years later, when Rebecca finally learned the truth that had been hidden from her all along, she would realize that God had been protecting her even during the moments she felt most forgotten. But before that discovery could happen, Rebecca would first have to experience a love story that seemed almost too perfect to fail. And at the center of that story was a young man she would soon meet for the very first time. Rebecca Mitchell first noticed Michael Carter on a rainy Tuesday afternoon during her second semester of college. She was hurrying across campus with a stack of books pressed against her chest when one of them slipped from her arms and landed in a puddle. "Oh no," Rebecca groaned. Before she could bend down, someone picked it up. "You know, most people use backpacks for this exact reason." Rebecca looked up and found herself staring into the smiling face of a tall young man holding her book. She laughed. "Thank you. And for the record, I do own a backpack." "Then I think we have identified the problem." Rebecca smiled despite herself. "I'm Rebecca." "Michael," he replied. "Nice to meet you." What began as a simple encounter quickly became something more. Over the next several weeks, they seemed to run into each other everywhere. The campus coffee shop, the library, student events, church gatherings. Soon Rebecca learned that Michael wasn't just charming. He was intelligent. He was confident without being arrogant. He was studying business and consistently ranked near the top of his class. More importantly, he appeared to love God. On Sunday mornings, Rebecca would often see him serving at church. One week he was helping with the sound system. The next week he was greeting people at the door. He knew Scripture well and spoke openly about his faith. To Rebecca, he seemed like the kind of man she had spent years praying for. One evening after a church event, Michael walked beside her toward the parking lot. "You know," he said, "I've been trying to think of a smooth way to ask you this." Rebecca laughed. "That sounds promising." "It's probably not." "Go ahead." Michael smiled. "Would you have dinner with me Friday night?" Rebecca felt her heart skip. "I'd like that." Their first date lasted nearly 4 hours. Then came another, and another. Conversations that began over dinner stretched late into the night. They talked about faith, family, dreams, the future. For the first time, Rebecca found herself imagining that the life she had always prayed for might finally be taking shape. Months turned into years. Their relationship deepened. Michael met her parents. Rebecca met his family. Friends began referring to them as if marriage was already inevitable. At church gatherings, people would smile knowingly whenever they arrived together. One afternoon, Rebecca's friend Ashley Morgan nudged her playfully. "So have you picked wedding colors yet?" Rebecca rolled her eyes. "Ashley, I'm serious. There isn't even a ring. Yet." Rebecca tried to hide her smile. The truth was she had begun thinking about it too. Not obsessively, not constantly, but enough. Enough to imagine what life as Michael's wife might look like. Enough to believe that God was finally answering the prayer she had carried since childhood. Even her parents seemed convinced. One evening during a family dinner, her father smiled at her. "Michael's a good man." Rebecca nodded. "He is." Her mother exchanged a glance with her father. "He's very good to you." Rebecca felt warmth spread across her face. She knew what they were implying. Everyone did. The future seemed clear. The road appeared mapped out. The waiting season she had endured for years appeared to be ending. Then everything changed. It happened on a quiet evening Rebecca would never forget. Michael had called earlier and asked if they could meet at a nearby park. His voice sounded different, distant, tense. By the time Rebecca arrived, he was already sitting on a bench staring into the distance. Something immediately felt wrong. She sat beside him. "Michael." He didn't answer right away. Finally, he sighed. "Rebecca, this is hard." Her stomach tightened. "What is?" Michael looked down at his hands. "I don't think we should be together anymore." For a moment, she thought she had misheard him. "What?" "I think we need to end this." Rebecca stared at him. The words didn't make sense. Not after everything. Not after years together. Not after all the plans. Not after all the conversations about the future. "Michael, what are you talking about?" He swallowed hard. "I just don't think this is right anymore." Rebecca's heart began pounding. "Did I do something?" "No." "Then what's happening?" Michael shook his head. I don't know how to explain it. Rebecca felt panic rising inside her. Michael, please. But the answers never came. Not the answers she needed. Not the answers that made sense. The conversation ended with more questions than explanations. And just like that, the future Rebecca had spent years believing in disappeared. When she drove home that night, tears blurred her vision. She barely remembered the journey. She only remembered pulling into her driveway and breaking down completely. The man she believed God had sent into her life was gone. The dreams she had quietly built were shattered. The future she thought was certain suddenly felt empty. For weeks, she moved through life in a fog. Church became difficult. Prayer became difficult. Even simple conversations became exhausting. People who once asked about wedding plans now avoided the subject altogether. Everywhere she looked were reminders of what she had lost. And as Rebecca cried herself to sleep night after night, she found herself asking the question that would follow her for years. Why would God allow this? What Rebecca could not see was that the answer to that question was already unfolding. The prayer she thought had been denied. The relationship she thought had been stolen. The heartbreak she thought had ruined her future. All of it was connected to a truth she would not discover until many years later. But before that revelation could come, Rebecca would have to walk through one of the loneliest seasons of her life. The months following Michael Carter's departure were some of the hardest Rebecca Mitchell had ever experienced. At first, she told herself the pain would fade quickly. People around her offered the same reassurance. Give it time, Ashley Morgan said one afternoon while sitting across from Rebecca at a coffee shop. You'll be okay. Rebecca forced a smile. I know. But deep inside, she wasn't sure. Because it wasn't only the loss of Michael that hurt. It was the loss of the future she thought God had promised her. For years, she had believed she was moving toward marriage. Now she wasn't even sure what direction her life was heading. The first wedding invitation arrived about 6 months after the breakup. Rebecca still remembered opening the envelope. It belonged to a college friend who had met her fiancé after Rebecca and Michael had already started dating. She stared at the invitation for several seconds. Then she quietly placed it on the kitchen table. A few days later, Ashley called. Did you get Emily's invitation? Yeah. You going? Rebecca hesitated. I think so. Ashley understood immediately. It's okay if it's hard. Rebecca sighed. I want to be happy for her. You can be happy for her and still hurt. The wedding day arrived. Rebecca put on a smile. She congratulated the bride. She posed for photographs. She applauded during the ceremony. But as she watched the newly married couple exchange vows, she felt tears threatening to appear. Not because she wasn't happy for them, but because she once believed she would be standing at an altar herself by now. As the years passed, the invitations continued arriving. One wedding became 3. 3 became 6. 6 became 10. Then 15. Then 17. Each invitation seemed to reopen wounds she thought had finally healed. Friends who once sat beside her in Bible studies were now posting family photographs. Friends who once asked for relationship advice were celebrating anniversaries. Friends who once worried they would never meet someone were now raising children. And Rebecca remained single. At wedding after wedding, she found herself standing beside brides as a bridesmaid. She adjusted veils, held bouquets, helped calm nervous brides before ceremonies. She smiled for photographs. She danced at receptions. Then she drove home alone. One evening after serving as a bridesmaid yet again, Rebecca sat in her car in the church parking lot long after everyone else had left. Her phone rang. It was Ashley. Hey, Ashley said gently. You still there? Rebecca wiped her eyes. Yeah. Ashley was silent for a moment. Tough day. Rebecca laughed softly through tears. You ever wonder if maybe God forgot to answer something? Ashley immediately understood. Rebecca, no, seriously. Her voice cracked. I prayed for years. She stared through the windshield. I did everything I knew to do. Ashley listened quietly. Rebecca continued. I wasn't asking for fame. I wasn't asking for millions of dollars. I wasn't asking for some perfect life. She paused. I just wanted a family. Ashley took a slow breath. I know. For several moments, neither woman spoke. Finally, Ashley said softly, God hasn't forgotten you. Rebecca wanted to believe that. She really did. But believing became harder every year. Family gatherings became increasingly difficult as well. Questions started innocently enough. During Thanksgiving one year, an aunt smiled and asked, So Rebecca, are you seeing anyone? No. A few months later at another gathering, a cousin asked, "Still single?" Rebecca smiled politely. "Yes." Then came the questions she dreaded most. "Have you tried online dating? What happened with that Michael guy? Don't you want children? Are you being too picky?" The words were usually spoken with good intentions, but they still hurt. Sometimes Rebecca felt as though everyone else viewed her life as incomplete, as though her value somehow depended on whether she wore a wedding ring. One Christmas dinner became especially painful. Several relatives were discussing their children and grandchildren. Rebecca quietly listened from the corner of the room. Then someone turned toward her. "So Rebecca, when are you finally going to settle down?" The room grew quiet. Several people looked uncomfortable. Rebecca forced a smile. "I'll let you know when I find out." Everyone laughed. But inside, she felt something breaking. That night she returned home emotionally exhausted. She sat alone in her apartment and looked at old photographs from years earlier. One photograph showed her and Michael Carter standing together outside church. Young, happy, certain about the future. Rebecca stared at the image for a long time. Then she whispered something she had never admitted aloud before. "God, did you forget me?" The words lingered in the silence. Immediately she felt guilty for asking. But they were honest. For years, she had watched others receive the very blessing she had prayed for. For years, she had remained faithful. For years she had waited. And still no answers came. What Rebecca did not know was that while she was questioning God's silence, pieces of a hidden story were slowly moving into place. Years continued to pass. Rebecca Mitchell kept praying. She kept attending church. She kept serving. From the outside, most people assumed she was doing fine. But privately, the questions were becoming harder to ignore. Every morning before work, she would sit at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee, her Bible open, and a journal beside her. One morning she quietly prayed, "Lord, I know you're listening. I know you care. I just don't understand." The silence that followed felt heavy. Not because she doubted God's existence. She didn't. What she struggled with was understanding his timing. The prayer she had carried since childhood remained unanswered. And with every passing year, the waiting became more difficult. One evening after Bible study, Ashley Morgan noticed Rebecca seemed unusually quiet. "You okay?" Ashley asked. Rebecca shrugged. "I think so. You don't sound convinced." Rebecca looked down. "Have you ever felt like everyone else is moving forward while you're standing still?" Ashley leaned back in her chair. "Sometimes." Rebecca sighed. "I just thought my life would look different by now." Ashley reached across the table. "Rebecca, God's still writing your story." Rebecca smiled politely. "I know that's true." But deep inside, she wondered why the story seemed to be taking so long. There were moments when doubt crept in unexpectedly. Not doubt about God, doubt about herself. Had she missed an opportunity? Had she made a wrong decision? Had the breakup with Michael Carter somehow changed the course of her future forever? Late one night, she found herself looking through old journals. Page after page contained prayers about marriage, family, and God's plan. Some entries were nearly 10 years old. Rebecca closed the journal and whispered, "Lord, what am I not seeing?" The answer never came. At least not then. Yet despite the questions, she couldn't walk away from her faith. She tried to imagine life without God and couldn't. He had carried her through too much. So she kept showing up. She kept praying. She kept believing, even when her feelings told her otherwise. And looking back years later, Rebecca would realize something important. The season when she felt closest to giving up was also the season when God was quietly preparing to reveal the truth. Because while Rebecca was struggling to understand the silence, information about Michael Carter was beginning to surface. Information she had never known. Information that would soon reach her through an unexpected conversation. And when that conversation finally happened, it would answer a question she had been asking for years. Why did God allow Michael Carter to walk away? A few weeks later, Rebecca Mitchell received a text message from Ashley Morgan. "Are you free Saturday afternoon?" Rebecca smiled when she saw the message. "Sure. Coffee." "Absolutely." Saturday arrived, and the two friends met at a small cafe they had visited countless times over the years. As usual, the conversation began with work, family, church, and life. For nearly an hour they talked and laughed. It felt good, simple, comfortable. But eventually the conversation slowed. Ashley stirred her coffee and seemed distracted. Rebecca noticed immediately. "What is it?" Ashley looked up. "What do you mean? You've been trying to say something for the last 10 minutes. Ashley gave a nervous laugh. Am I that obvious? Very. For a moment, Ashley didn't respond. She glanced down at her cup, then back at Rebecca. I wasn't sure if I should bring this up. Rebecca frowned slightly. Bring what up? Ashley hesitated. Then she said the name Rebecca hadn't heard in a long time. Michael Carter. Rebecca felt her stomach tighten. Even after all these years, hearing his name carried weight. Not pain like before, but something close to it. Ashley immediately noticed her reaction. I'm sorry. No, it's okay, Rebecca replied. What about him? Ashley exhaled slowly. I ran into someone from college a few months ago. Rebecca waited. And we got to talking. About Michael? Ashley nodded. Rebecca sat back in her chair. The curiosity was immediate. For years she had known almost nothing about what happened after he left. At first she occasionally heard small updates through mutual friends. Then even those stopped. Eventually Michael Carter became a closed chapter. Or at least she thought he had. What did they say? Rebecca asked. Ashley looked uncomfortable. Honestly, I wish I hadn't heard some of it. Rebecca's eyebrows furrowed. What do you mean? Ashley lowered her voice. Rebecca, there were things going on back then that nobody knew about. The words instantly caught her attention. What things? Ashley paused. As far as everyone could tell, Michael had everything together. Rebecca nodded. That's what I thought too. Apparently that wasn't the whole story. Rebecca's heartbeat quickened. Ashley continued carefully. After college, some people found out he had been dealing with serious financial problems for years. Rebecca blinked. What? Ashley nodded. Debt. A lot of it. Rebecca stared at her. That doesn't make sense. I know. He never mentioned anything. That's because hardly anyone knew. Rebecca sat silently. For years, she had replayed the breakup in her mind. She had questioned herself endlessly. But she had never imagined Michael might have been carrying struggles he never revealed. Ashley continued. That wasn't all. Rebecca felt a growing uneasiness. What else? Ashley hesitated again. Several people said he became involved with things that completely changed him. What kind of things? Ashley chose her words carefully. The kind of choices that damaged relationships. Rebecca remained silent. Ashley looked directly at her. Apparently people close to him started noticing major changes not long after college. Rebecca slowly shook her head. No. It surprised me too. For years, she had remembered Michael as the young man who served in church. The young man who quoted scripture. The young man everyone believed would become a great husband and father. Now Ashley was describing someone very different. Someone Rebecca barely recognized. What happened? Rebecca asked quietly. Ashley sighed. I don't know every detail. But from what I heard, things got progressively worse. Rebecca looked out the cafe window. Her mind was racing. Questions she had carried for years suddenly began resurfacing. Questions she thought she had buried. Ashley leaned forward. Rebecca, there's something else. Rebecca looked back at her. What? The person I spoke with knew Michael pretty well during those years. Ashley paused. And they said something I'll never forget. Rebecca waited. Ashley swallowed. They said if people had known what was really happening behind closed doors, nobody would have been surprised that the relationship ended. Rebecca felt completely still. The noise of the cafe seemed to disappear. For years she had viewed the breakup as a mystery. A painful unanswered question. Now, for the first time, she was hearing that there may have been reasons she never knew existed. Reasons hidden from everyone, including her. Ashley watched her friend's expression carefully. You okay? Rebecca nodded slowly. I think so. But the truth was she wasn't sure what to think. Part of her wanted to dismiss everything she had heard. Another part couldn't stop wondering. What exactly had been happening? How much had Michael Carter hidden? And most importantly, what would her life have looked like if the relationship had continued? As Rebecca drove home later that afternoon, she couldn't stop thinking about Ashley's words. For years she had believed God had taken something good away from her. For years she had viewed Michael's departure as one of the greatest disappointments of her life. But now, for the first time, another possibility began to emerge. What if she had been protected from something she couldn't see? What if the prayer she thought God ignored had actually been answered in a way she never expected? Rebecca didn't have all the answers yet, but she was closer than she had ever been. Over the next several weeks, Rebecca Mitchell found herself thinking about that conversation with Ashley Morgan more than she expected. At first, she tried to move on. After all, the breakup with Michael Carter had happened years ago. The chapter was over. Or at least she thought it was. But the questions wouldn't leave her mind. One evening, Ashley called. Hey, are you busy? Not really, Rebecca replied. I heard something else. Rebecca immediately knew who Ashley was talking about. Michael. Yeah. Rebecca sat down slowly. What did you hear? Ashley took a deep breath. The person I told you about connected me with someone who knew Michael after college. Rebecca remained silent. And they told me things were much worse than people realized. Rebecca felt her chest tighten. Ashley continued. Apparently the financial problems weren't temporary. They got bigger. Much bigger. Rebecca shook her head in disbelief. The Michael Carter she remembered had always seemed responsible, focused, ambitious. The news didn't fit the image she had carried for years. What happened? Rebecca asked. Ashley sighed. From what I understand, he started making one bad decision after another, trying to solve problems quickly, taking risks, borrowing money, hiding things. Rebecca stared at the wall. The words felt heavy, because secrecy was something she had never associated with Michael. At least not back then. Ashley continued. Eventually people close to him stopped trusting him. Rebecca closed her eyes. Years earlier, she would have defended Michael without hesitation. Now she wasn't so sure. A few days later, Rebecca received another unexpected piece of information. A former college acquaintance reached out after hearing she had spoken with Ashley. During their conversation, Michael's name came up again. The woman hesitated before speaking. Rebecca, I don't know how much you've heard. Not much, Rebecca admitted. The woman sighed. There were a lot of things people didn't know. Rebecca felt her pulse quicken. What kind of things? The answer wasn't dramatic. It was worse. Because it was real. A pattern had emerged in Michael's life. Broken trust. Damaged relationships. Promises made and not kept. Opportunities wasted. People hurt. Again and again. Rebecca listened quietly. The more she heard, the more stunned she became. Not because Michael had become a perfect villain. He hadn't. He was a flawed human being making destructive choices. But the life she was hearing about looked nothing like the future she once imagined. After the call ended, Rebecca sat in silence. For a long time, her eyes drifted toward an old photo album sitting on a shelf nearby. Inside were pictures from college. Pictures from church events. Pictures from a season when she believed Michael Carter would become her husband. Slowly, she opened the album. There they were, smiling together, laughing together, planning a future together. For years those photographs had represented loss. Now they represented something else. A narrow escape. The realization hit her gradually. Then all at once. If Michael had never ended the relationship. If the wedding everyone expected had happened. If the future she prayed for had arrived exactly when she wanted it. Her life could have been completely different. The financial struggles. The broken trust. The instability. The pain. She could have been standing in the middle of all of it. Tears filled her eyes. Not tears of heartbreak. Tears of understanding. For years she had asked God the same question. Why? Why did Michael leave? Why did the relationship end? Why did she have to attend 17 weddings while everyone else's life seemed to move forward? Why did heaven remain silent? Now, for the first time, the pieces were beginning to fit together. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough to see something she had never seen before. That night, Rebecca knelt beside her bed. The same place where she had cried countless times. The same place where she had questioned God. The same place where she had wondered whether she had been forgotten. This time her prayer was different. Lord, her voice trembled. I think I understand. Tears rolled down her face. Not everything, but enough. She paused, then whispered the words she never thought she would say. Thank you. Years earlier, those words would have seemed impossible. Thank you for the breakup. Thank you for the closed door. Thank you for the disappointment. Thank you for the waiting. Yet that was exactly what she was feeling. Because the delay she had hated for so long now looked different. The unanswered prayer looked different. The heartbreak looked different. The silence looked different. Rebecca finally understood that God had not been withholding a blessing. He had been protecting one. The relationship she desperately wanted had not been removed to punish her. It had been removed to preserve her. And as she sat there reflecting on everything she had learned, another realization began to settle into her heart. If God had been faithful all those years while she couldn't see it, then perhaps he was still working on the rest of her story. After that night of prayer, something began to change inside Rebecca Mitchell. Not overnight, not all at once, but gradually. For years, she had measured her life against a timeline she thought God should follow. By a certain age, she expected to be married. By a certain age, She expected to have children. By a certain age, she expected her future to look a certain way. But now, after learning the truth about Michael Carter, Rebecca found herself releasing those expectations. For the first time in years, she stopped asking, "When?" and started asking, "What do you want me to do today, Lord?" She became more involved in ministries she genuinely loved. She mentored younger women. She volunteered in community outreach programs. She spent more time with family and friends. And slowly, the peace she had been searching for began returning. One Sunday morning after church, Ashley Morgan noticed the difference. "You seem happier," Ashley said as they walked toward the parking lot. Rebecca smiled. "I think I finally stopped fighting God." Ashley laughed softly. "That's usually when things start making sense." A few months later, Rebecca attended a church-sponsored volunteer event. She almost didn't go. The weather was bad. She was tired from work. And she had considered staying home. But at the last minute, she decided to go anyway. That simple decision would change everything. While helping organize supplies, she noticed a man carrying several heavy boxes toward the building. One of the boxes slipped. Before it could fall, Rebecca rushed forward. "I got it." The man smiled. "Thank you." "That would have been embarrassing." Rebecca laughed. "It would have been entertaining." The man laughed too. "I'm Jonathan Hayes." Rebecca Mitchell. "It's nice to meet you, Rebecca." Unlike her first meeting with Michael Carter years earlier, there was no immediate rush of emotion. No overwhelming certainty. No dramatic moment. Just a simple conversation. And strangely enough, that felt refreshing. Over the next several months, they crossed paths repeatedly through church activities and volunteer events. Their friendship developed naturally. One evening after a community project, Jonathan asked, "Would you like to get dinner sometime?" Rebecca smiled. "I'd like that." What followed was very different from her relationship with Michael. There was no pressure. No racing toward milestones. No assumptions about the future. Instead, there were conversations. Honest conversations. About faith. About struggles. About mistakes. About God's grace. One night during dinner, Jonathan looked at her and said, "Can I tell you something?" "Of course. I admire your faith." Rebecca smiled. "Why?" "Because most people only trust God when life goes according to plan." He paused. "You kept trusting him even when it didn't." Rebecca felt emotional hearing those words. Because Jonathan had no idea how many nights she had cried. How many questions she had asked. How many times she had wondered whether God had forgotten her. Yet somehow, God had carried her through all of it. As their relationship continued to grow, Rebecca noticed something else. Jonathan wasn't trying to become the center of her life. And she wasn't trying to make him the center of hers. God remained the foundation. Their relationship was built on shared faith, mutual respect, and patience. The very things Rebecca now realized mattered most. One evening after church, Jonathan and Rebecca sat outside watching the sunset. Jonathan smiled. "You know something?" "What?" "I'm really grateful I met you." Rebecca smiled back. "So am I." As she looked at him, she couldn't help thinking about the years she once viewed as wasted. The 17 weddings. The unanswered prayers. The heartbreak. The waiting. Now she saw them differently. Because if Michael Carter had never left, if God had answered her prayer exactly when she wanted, she never would have become the woman sitting here today. And she never would have met Jonathan Hayes. For the first time, Rebecca could clearly see that God's timing had never been working against her. It had been working for her all along. Several months later, Rebecca Mitchell found herself standing in a church sanctuary once again. The sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows. Soft music filled the room. Rows of family and friends smiled from their seats. But this time, Rebecca wasn't standing beside another bride. This time, she was the bride. As she looked down the aisle, her eyes met Jonathan Hayes. He smiled. The kind of smile that brought peace. The kind of smile that reminded her of God's faithfulness. As Rebecca walked toward him, memories flooded her mind. The breakup with Michael Carter. The lonely nights. The tears. The questions. The 17 weddings she attended while wondering if everyone else's prayers were being answered before hers. For years, she had viewed those moments as evidence that God was silent. Now she saw something completely different. She saw protection. She saw guidance. She saw mercy. After the ceremony, Rebecca and Jonathan greeted family and friends during the reception. At one point, Ashley Morgan pulled Rebecca aside. "Can you believe this?" Ashley asked with tears in her eyes. Rebecca laughed. "Honestly, no." The two women laughed together. Then Ashley smiled. You made it. Rebecca looked around the room. At Jonathan. At her family. At the people celebrating with them. Then she gently shook her head. No. Ashley looked confused. No. Rebecca smiled. God carried me. Ashley squeezed her hand. I think you're right. Years later, Rebecca would often share her story with younger women going through their own seasons of waiting. Whenever someone asked how she survived those difficult years, her answer was always the same. I stopped focusing on what God hadn't given me and started trusting Him for what He could see that I couldn't. Because that was the lesson she learned. The relationship she desperately wanted with Michael Carter wasn't taken away to harm her. It was taken away to protect her. The years she thought were not wasted at all. They were preparing her, strengthening her, teaching her to trust God beyond her own understanding. Rebecca finally understood what she could not see during those painful years. God wasn't withholding a blessing. He was preserving one. And sometimes the doors God closes are every bit as important as the doors He opens. So if you're in a season of waiting right now, wondering why certain prayers seem unanswered, remember Rebecca Mitchell's story. The delay may not be punishment. The closed door may not be rejection. And the silence may not mean God has forgotten you. Because one day, just as Rebecca discovered, you may look back and realize that what felt like disappointment was actually protection, what felt like loss was actually mercy, and what felt like God's absence was His hand guiding you all along.